Today, what I will be talking about is applying specifically cognitive science to foreign language learning. So the expectations for this specific session are that I'm going to show you a couple of findings, I'm going to show you some research, and it is about encouraging some reflection on basis of research, okay? It's also an opportunity for a bidirectional dialogue. So I'm not here telling you stuff. It's more kind of, I'm giving you a couple of pointers, and it's up to you to think about, okay, how can you use this? And probably some things you are already using. So what this session is not, it's not going to give you must follow rules, okay? So you are experts in your field, and it's about giving a couple of ideas on how things could be tweaked slightly, or really just confirmation of what you're doing. So I'm expecting that there will be overlap between what I'm telling you today or I'm saying today and your own teaching practice. And what I can't do, and what no researcher can do, is to answer or to have answers for all events and eventualities in the classroom, right? Every classroom is different, every situation is different, every student is different, and so you know your students best, and it's about kind of getting a bit different ideas and maybe coming out of this session with something you want to try out, or with something that you didn't know before and now you know more about, okay? So my area of expertise is cognitive psychology, and that is specifically an area in psychology that investigates our memory. It investigates our attention. What do we pay attention to? When do we lose attention? When do we lose focus? How we make judgments, specifically in learning, for example, how we make judgments about our own learning, right? So when do students decide that I'm done learning, I'm done studying, right? It looks at perception, it looks at decision-making and problem solving. So as we can see, all those building blocks, they can help us inform teaching and learning strategies, okay? So they can be applied to the classroom, and in our case here, to foreign language learning. What I'm going to do today, I'm going to talk about two specific learning strategies. I'm going to talk about space practice, and I'm going to talk about retrieval practice. I will always give an overview of what it is and why it happens. I will give you a flavor on how it is investigated. So how do we examine and know what we know about the specific phenomena, and how to apply it, right? So let's start with space practice. So the main idea of space practice is that if you have multiple study sessions, let's say the most simple way, you have two study sessions. One session, let's say, where you introduce new grammar, and then a second session where you repeat that information, where you do a review of that material. Now, what you can do is you can have those repetitions back to back, or you can have time between the first studying or the first exposure and the second one. And you can pretty much play around with that time, with that gap and break in between, okay? Now, the space practice effect is the benefit of longer spacing between first exposure and re-exposure to the material on a final test later on. So if you take the exact same study time, so that's really important, the overall study time is exactly the same. Let's say 1 hour on a Monday and another hour on a Tuesday. So it's exactly the same. The only thing you do is, for example, say 1 hour on a Monday and 1 hour on a Friday. So you space out your practice, yeah? So This dates back to Hermann Ebbinghaus from 1885, and he tested this as himself as a participant, that when you have a fixed amount of study time and you distribute it over a longer period of time, then your learning is benefited by it. To put it in his own words, with any considerable number of repetitions, a suitable distribution of them over a space of time is decidedly more advantageous than the massing of them at a single time. Now, let's look at how this is investigated, okay? So here participants studied a science text, and in one condition, they only studied it once, okay? So they were allowed to read the text once, and then they had a test immediately after or 2 days later. In another condition, they were given the opportunity to read the text twice in immediate succession. So they read it one time, and then immediately after, they reread the text. And again, they had a test immediately or 2 days later. And finally, in this condition, they were also given the opportunity to read the text twice, but there was a week of break in between. So they read it, a week of break, and then they reread it again. And again, a test immediately after, or 2 days later. We have a single, a masked, and a distributed or spaced practice condition. The first thing I'm going to show you are the results on the immediate test, right? The test done immediately after they were done with studying. And this is what it looks like. Immediately after, the participants who studied in a masked fashion, so had 2 exposures back to back, outperformed the other conditions. But what happens on a test 2 days later? It turns around, right? 2 days later, participants who had a break in between one reading and another one outperformed all other conditions. And I like to show this finding because it shows us why our intuitive inclination to cram actually helps us in the short term. But what we're not good at actually judging is that in the long term, that leads to more forgetting, okay? So in this one here, we have a group of high school students studying French vocabulary learning, vocabulary. So they had 3 days. And in the spaced practice condition, on day 1, they had a 10-minute MCQ exercise on the vocabulary. On day 2, they had a fill-in exercise for the vocabulary. And on the 3rd day, they had a cue recall quiz. In the math practice condition, they did the full 30 minutes in one session on day 3. Okay, so as you can see, the time of practicing and the exercises were exactly the same in both conditions. The only difference was that in one condition, it was separated from one day to the next, and the other one, everything was crammed into one day. They had a test immediately after, so 10 minutes after, and 7 days after, okay? So the first, what I'm going to show you is the performance on that immediate test 10 minutes after they were done with studying. And what you can see here is that there's really not much difference between those 2 conditions. Actually, it's quite similar, and we can't really see a difference there. However, what happens on the delayed tests when they need the vocabulary a week later? The participants who were able or who had the spaced practice schedule with exactly the same exercises, with exactly the same time, they outperformed the other participants. In this one here, these are high school students in Iran, and they were English foreign learners. In the beginning, they had a pre-test to test their knowledge of vocabulary using a fill-in-the-blank test in the very beginning. And then for 12 weeks, they were in different conditions. The words, so 15 words were either shown per week in a space practice condition, so 3 times 20 minutes per week. Or it was once per week for 60 minutes. So that was the more spaced condition, that was the more masked condition. And then there was a control condition that didn't have a specific vocabulary-focused instruction, right? So what you can see here, again, between the space and the masked practice, the overall time, total time is exactly the same. The only difference is that for space practice, it was 3 times 20 minutes per week, and in the other one, it was cramped in 1 session per week. They had an immediate post-test a week later, and they had a more delayed test 4 weeks later of the vocabulary. And what they found was, in both of those tests, participants who had practiced the words in a spaced practice format performed better than in the other conditions, right? So again, what we see is that in the longer term, a week later, 4 weeks later, a month later, and so on, we see the benefit of just changing slightly and introducing gaps in between repeating and learning the vocabulary and the material. Now, I have the following activity for you. Maybe some of your students like to use flashcards to study vocabulary, grammar structures, and so on. I'm going to give you 2 scenarios, right? So let's say you want them to study 20 concepts, 20 vocabulary pairs. I give you the following choice. You take a stack of 20 cards and you divide it up in smaller stacks of 4 stacks with 5 vocabulary each per stack. And then I tell you, you take the first small stack, you study it 4 times in a row, then you take the second stack 4 times in a row, and so on. So that's scenario 1. And scenario 2 is you leave the big pile of 20 stacks in 1 stack and study that one 4 times in a row. My question to you is, would you advise your students to study with the small stacks, 4 smaller stacks, or would you recommend them studying with the large stack? You can scan this in. For smaller stacks or 1 large stack, what would you tell your students to do? Okay, I think we have ADA logged in, but only a couple of. So this is the result at the moment. So we have a majority for 4 smaller stacks over 1 large stack. Okay. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to try to convince you to use the large stack. Now, because this study has actually been done, so they used a web-based study with the studying of synonym pairs of the university entry test in the US. And they had 20 of the word pairs in one large stack. And they had 20 other words, but they divided it up in 4 smaller stacks of 5 cards each. In session 1, they studied the small stacks 4 times in a row, each of them. And then the large stack 4 times in a row. And a day later, they had a final test on the words. After studying, what we like to do in cognitive psychology is we like to ask the learner, what do you think? How well will you do on a future test? Okay, so what percentage of the small versus large stack words do you think you will be able to remember on the test tomorrow? So we'd like to kind of find out if the students have a good understanding of their own learning. So it's called metacognition. So it's your own understanding of your own learning processes. And we ask them to make a prediction. How well do you think you will do? Okay. Now, what I'm going to show you is I'm going to show you the results of the test, the day later, the test. And what we can see is that students perform better on the words that were presented in the large stack compared to the small stacks. And I'm already giving away the answer there. Small stacks I labeled as math practice and large stack as space practice. And why is that the case? Because if I have a large stack of cards and I ask you to practice it 4 times, right? So I read the first card and I practice that. I put it in the back. Then I have 19 other cards before I re-encounter the first one. So the spacing between studying that first card again is 19 other cards. Compared to if I have a small stack of only 5 cards, you come back to that same vocabulary quicker. So your spacing is much smaller, right? So more forgetting helps you to remember information in the future. But when you ask students, what do you think? What condition will be better for you? What stack will be better for you? They say the other way around, exactly what you said here as well. So they think it feels easier to have the smaller stack. It feels kind of that I'm taking in more information. But that feeling of ease is actually does not translate into storing information in memory in a way that you can access it in the future when you need it a day later, a week later, a month later, and so on. So you need that specific effort in order to boost your memory for that information. Now, and this one here, that's an interesting one. They looked at 150 Korean students from 6 universities who were learning English as a foreign language. And they used low-frequency English words. And they had 2 conditions, so a space condition and a math condition. So this was the week, Monday to Friday. And in the math condition, they studied the material in a large section on that Friday. In the space practice, they had the same study time, but it was divided across all 5 days. Okay, so that was the difference between those groups. Again, there were different tests immediately after, and there was a test 2 weeks later. What I'm going to show you again, because what we are really interested in is long-term retention of the material, right? So I'm going to show you the scores, the test scores for the two-week delayed tests. And what we can see here is that for fill-in-the-blank questions and flashcard questions, in both cases, the space practice condition outperformed the math practice condition. So giving more time between one session and the next, introducing some forgetting helps you to maintain and recall that information in the future. So we know that space practice really works well for level for L2 learning, for language learning. It works particularly well on delayed tests. So the advantages are not as clear on very immediate tests, but quite clear on delayed tests. And that's what we want in language learning, right? So we want that delayed benefit of studying, of understanding, of being able to use grammar, vocabulary in conversations in the future. It helps young learners and adults and works for vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation learning as well. Now, one thing is that we would like to understand why this effect occurs. Why is space practice better than math practice? The short answer to this is that even after 100 years of studying this effect, we still don't have a complete understanding why it works. We know that it works, but we don't really understand why exactly it works. We have some theories or ideas of why it works, and I'm going to walk you through them. And the first one is the importance of forgetting in reactivation. So it is about introducing strategically some forgetting and then reactivating that knowledge when it's basically just almost forgotten, but still there. And that reactivation really boosts a memory for that specific information, right? So it is about introducing those forgetting processes in learning, which sounds not very intuitive, but that is basically that effort that we put in when we reactivate something we have previously studied is what seems to be an important mechanism. Now, the second mechanism, I'm going to walk you through this, but it actually is an important one to understand because it helps us understand how our memory works. And that is the variation of context idea. Now, bear with me. You don't have to read what's on the slide. Just listen what I'm saying because it's a bit complex, but I'm going to walk you through this. So the idea is that whenever we learn something, let's say vocabulary, the thing we are learning is the target information. Let's say vocabulary pairs, yeah? So that's the target information that is stored, hopefully, in our memory. Now, whenever we study, however, that's not the only information that we store in our memory. We store context information as well. So, for example, the temperature in the room, the weather outside, our mood, so what mood we were in. And those are all contextual variables that are also stored in our memory, okay? So whenever we go back to the same material, that target material stays the same, but the context in which we study, that will vary every time we go back to the material. Now, the idea is that the more varied that context is that we store in our memory, the better it is for us. We will be more successful in the future to recall the target information. And the reason for that is that when in the future we need that information, what happens is that we will sample context variables that are around us, and we will match it to the ones we have stored in memory. And if there is a match, the target information that is attached to it is easier to recall. That's how an idea of how our memory works. That our memory works very much based on cues in the environment. And that helps us recall information. Okay? Now, with spaced practice, the idea is when we introduce those breaks and have different sessions, that every time we restudy specific target information, different kind of context is always stored along in our memory. And so we have a very variable context information in our memory that we can match later on when we need it in the future, because then we have the match with the context when we need to recall it. So it's a bit complex, but it's kind of understanding how our memory works. One example of this is, I don't know if you have ever, you probably have, experienced when, let's say you are in the living room, right? You are in the living room and you go in the kitchen because you wanted to do something in the kitchen. But once you arrive in the kitchen, you don't know anymore. You're like, what did I want to do here? So one way to get that memory back of that target information that you wanted to do is to go back to the living room, use the cues in the environment to cue the memory, and then you remember, oh, yeah, I wanted to get some milk. And you go back to the kitchen and retrieve the item. So that's just as an example for you to understand how a memory works. Now, there are different ways on how you can implement spaced practice. And one question I get asked quite a lot is, how do I space it exactly, right? So what's the right spacing? And the answer to this is, we don't know. We can't tell you exactly. It should be a day or a week or so on. What we know is that any kind of spacing is helpful for long-term retention of the material. And one thing that you could do is an expanding learning schedule. So you have an initial learning session, a smaller spacing in the beginning, and then you space it out with like smaller reactivation tasks over the course of time, with the spacing between them getting larger and larger over time. Now, from a research point of view, we don't have strong evidence that this schedule is more effective than, let's say, an equal learning schedule, where the breaks in between are always exactly the same. However, as a teacher myself, I find it easier to implement an expanding learning schedule that's a bit more variable than one that's always rigid and equal. So I would suggest to play around with this, look at the schedule that you have and see how it works for you. So some practical tips here. It is about reviewing older material formally or informally, using different exercises. Learners need support to do this. So it's not something that's easy to do, to come up with a schedule and then to stick with the schedule. Learners tend, or humans actually in general, tend to cram. You can review older material by doing it quite informally, by asking them to reactivate something you have practiced with them before, explain in their own words. It does feel hard, spaced practice does feel hard, but it's important to encourage the learner and to remind them that forgetting that they're experiencing between one session and the next one is actually what makes the strategy successful. So to put it in the limerick of Ulrich Neisser, he was a memory researcher in psychology. You can get a good deal from rehearsal if it just has the proper dispersal. You would just be asked to do it en masse. Your remembering would turn out much worse. Okay. Okay, now I'm going to take a bit of a break, and I have practiced this, and I'm sorry if I'm completely going to botch the pronunciation. What we're going to do is one good thing, which is Kuepper-Tetzel. Maybe? Kuepper-Tetzel. Again, Please correct me if I'm wrong. I have asked my Japanese friend for this. Okay. And what I would like you to do for this is to think about, and that has, it's just a wee activity, is to think about one good thing that has happened in your life in the past week. Okay? It could be something very small. Maybe you tried some new food, or you met a friend and had a conversation, and it could be something bigger as well. You came up with a new idea for anything. So it could be anything. But I would like you to do is just because we very often in our lives, I think we focus on criticism or negativity and problems. And I find it quite refreshing to focus on one very positive thing that you experienced in your life this week. And I would like to ask you to share it anonymously using this QR code. Yokoto Stotzel. The second part is what I'm struggling with. Oh, so beautiful things are coming up. Joined a flower arrangement workshop. I bought some new pajamas. I love new pajamas. It's great. I'm over my cold. Yay. Oh, yeah, there have been a wave of cold here as well. My daughter passed the entrance exam of the school which she had wanted to enter. Talking with a Brazilian woman and learning about her job. Oh, tasty fresh sushi. Well, I think we can't compete with. I have a very good sushi place I go to here, but yeah, one day I have to go to Japan to actually have proper sushi. So beautiful sunset while driving. Oh, this is beautiful. Relaxing at home, my favorite thing. Relaxing and reading at home with my cats, my favorite thing. Oh, got engaged. Congratulations. Oh, thank you so very much. You can keep them going. You can absolutely keep them going. It's absolutely fabulous to see so many positive things. And obviously, I'm sharing all with you afterwards as well. Okay. Now, let's continue. So we're going to continue actually with an activity. And my question is for you. My question for you is this. What do you think quizzes are for? What are the goals of quizzes in your view? Again, you can scan this in and then you can tell me what you think. What do you use quizzes for? So many good things. Keep them coming. I'm going to share already what you're writing, but do keep them coming. To check understanding, how remembering a good thing can be to affect your memory. For motivation, it's to motivate your students, and it can be very motivating to take a quiz and get questions right and know where you are with your understanding. To get people interested, so it could be something that you do in the beginning to see, okay, what's already out there, and to kind of tease them to find out, for them to want to find out more. Activate your brain. This is all good. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, now, what we know from spaced practice is that repetition is key for learning, right? But the question is now, what should repetition look like to be most effective? And that takes us to retrieval practice as a learning strategy. Now, the main idea here is that, let's say you have studying in the beginning and you have your final test in the end, right? So the question now is, what happens in between? One scenario could be you restudy, right? Could be vocabulary, grammar structures, ideas, when you read a book with them in English language. So you study it, or they study it, and then they restudy it. For example, by rereading it, or you teach it for the first time, and then you reteach it again, right? So that's an opportunity, that's an option for you to do. Alternatively, you could instead do a practice test in between. So you have exposed students to the material initially, and then you do a quiz, you do a little test, and have them remember the information from memory. Now, the retrieval practice effect is the benefit of taking practice tests as form of learning. And that enhances their understanding and their memory for that information in the long term, more so than just restudying it. Everything you said in your small survey there is on the slide. You said retrieval practice is good because it affects, they know what they don't know, they understand where they are, it's a form of assessment. It helps them to understand what they don't know, so they can allocate study time to the things that they have not mastered yet. And it can be motivating. It can be fun to first see what you have understood, but also to kind of find out more about something you don't know yet. All these aspects have an effect on learning performance. So taking a quiz or retrieval practice indirectly affects learning performance through feedback, study allocation, and motivation. Now, most importantly, though, is that retrieval practice has a direct effect on learning performance. So just the act of retrieving information from memory, of bringing information to mind from memory, that process in itself is learning, okay? And we know this from examples in the real world. One example that I like to use are phone numbers, right? How many phone numbers do you still remember? It's probably your own phone number and maybe some very old one from back in the 80s or 90s. Yeah, those are the numbers you remember. And the reason why those are the ones you remember is because those are the ones that you have repeatedly recalled from memory. All others, you don't even look them up anymore. They are on your phone, right? So you don't have to ever remember them. So another example is navigation. Any kind of navigation software is great, right? You want to go, you are at A, you want to go to B, you type it in, it takes you there. But the problem with that is you could end up doing this repeatedly over and over, going to the same, destination, but without ever learning it, because that process never requires you to do it from memory without any help. Because when you actually navigate a city or place without navigation system, what you're doing is you pay attention to the environment. You pay attention, oh, I have to turn right there, there's the sushi shop, right? I have to turn left here, there is the laundromat. I have to go, oh, there's kind of this nice park, and I have to go right here again. So you actually storing this kind of information, those cues I have talked about earlier, you're storing those cues and they help you later on remember that information, right? If we never do it from memory, it's going to be hard for us to actually do it from memory in the future. And the other examples are music, lyrics. To show you how it was, how it's investigated. So here, students read a text 4 times in one condition. And in the other condition, they read it once. And then they were asked, put a blank piece of paper and asked to remember everything they can and write it down. So to do a brain dump. Then they were asked, afterwards, they were asked, okay, let me know, what do you think, how well will you do on a future test? Now, the students who had read the text 4 times, they were very confident. You know, I read this 4 times. I've got this. Completely understand what's going on. No problem, give me a text, yeah? The students who read the text only once and then had to recall from memory, they were not so sure, because that felt more effortful. That felt kind of not really that they're getting somewhere. And so they were more conservative in their assessment of their own learning. But what actually happens? What is the actual learning on a later test? It is actually the other way around. So the students who had at least one opportunity to recall information from memory perform better than the students who read it 4 times. So one thing that you may be using in your classes is imitation. So here, undergrad students learned Hebrew nouns. And imitation means that you hear the word in the foreign language, and then you repeat the word out loud. So basically, it's imitating the pronunciation, okay? And they were interested to find out what is better, imitation or retrieval practice. So what you see here is that a picture was shown. At the same time, the word was played, like the audio file was played, and then the learner repeated the word out loud. And then the next trial happened, okay? So that was the imitation condition. In the retrieval practice condition, they showed the picture, and then the learner tried to produce the word out loud. And only afterwards, the audio file was played. So again, the difference here is that the learner had to pronounce it first. They had to recall first and try to pronounce it first. And then they got the audio file as feedback. And in the imitation, they got the audio file with the picture and they imitated the pronunciation, okay? So they had final test immediately after training or 2 days later. And one of the tests was a comprehension test. So they had to pick the correct picture for the word. And in the immediate test, there was no difference between imitation and retrieval practice. But on the delayed test, retrieval practice outperformed imitation. What about the more difficult test, which was the production test? So they saw the picture and they had to pronounce the word out loud. Here in both tests, independent of when it was given the test, retrieval practice outperformed students. students in the retrieval practice condition were better in both tests than students who had used imitations. What's really important to understand is that during practice, imitation actually led to higher performance throughout. But that higher performance during practice did not translate to a later test. Okay. So what do we know then in regard to why this occurs and why this happens? We know that effortful retrieval of the material enhances performance. That means we need that extra effort and a reactivation of the memory traces that happens when we re-engage with the material after some forgetting has occurred. The idea is here that it either strengthens those memories, so it kind of gets this boost. Another idea is that if we engage with this in a more effortful way, we create multiple ways to the same information, so multiple routes to the same information, which helps remembering the information in the long term. Now, what I'm going to do actually, I'm going to actually go to a different part here. Bear with me. 1 second. Here we go. Okay. Now, going to practical tips for retrieval practice. We know that it can be implemented in many different ways. So there is not just one single way on how you can do it. You can do it more formally, you can do it more informally. Think, pair, share is, for example, one way to do retrieval practice, where you have them think first, maybe write it down their own, share with their partners, and then share more widely. Small quizzes. It can also be used for more complex materials as well. So it's not bound to one specific isolated facts, but if you ask about more complex ideas and have them recall it from memory, that's what's going to be boosted. Retrieval practice will need scaffolding, for example, for students who have low prior knowledge or novel learners of language. So they need more cues in order to get to the stage where they can retrieve themselves. So try to make it a regular activity for them. To put it in the words of Aristotle, exercise in repeatedly recalling a thing strengthens the memory. Now, I talked about two strategies, right? I talked about spaced practice and I talked about retrieval practice. Now, the beauty about those two strategies is that they can be nicely combined, because spaced practice is all about the space in between one session and the next. And retrieval practice is essentially what you're doing during those sessions. So this is an example of 72 second-year Japanese pharmaceutical students at a university in Japan. They had a 12-week course of conversational English, and they had two conditions for their weekly quizzes. So this is what it looked like. So they had 8 item sets of vocabulary of target items over the course of 8 weeks. And then starting in week 2, they had weekly quizzes from there on out. Now, those weekly quizzes were either cumulative quizzes or non-cumulative quizzes. So cumulative quizzes means that, let's say, the quiz in week 4 had questions and items on weeks prior to that week 5. So in class 5, for example, they had week the weekly quiz 4, and that quiz had items from week 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and so on. That was the cumulative quiz. The non-cumulative quiz, that quiz would only have items from quiz set 5, so only for that respective week. So that was the difference. So it was basically just how mixed up the quiz questions were on that specific quiz and if it covered older material or not, okay? And what I'm going to show you, the first thing I'm going to show you is the performance during the weekly quizzes, right? So what you can see is over the course of those 8 weeks, those weekly quizzes, you can see that students who had the non-cumulative quizzes, so the quizzes that only always had the items from that specific week, they perform better than the cumulative ones, right? And it's not, that's not surprising because the non-cumulative ones, they are easier. They have, quiz questions in there that are not forgotten as much as the ones that have cumulative questions from weeks ago, okay? But what happens on a test later on, 3 weeks later after final practice? And what we see here is that for productive and receptive tests, so L1 to L2 or L2 to L1, in both of those tests, we find that the cumulative weekly quizzes were better in retaining the information than the non-cumulative ones. And that's quite interesting because it's a very small tweak that can be made as part of homework, as part of a worksheet you give them. If you mix it up and have older material on there that they're required to work on, you're basically introducing spaced retrieval practice. And that really helps them remember information. Okay, I'm almost done. The final thing I would like to do with you is I would like to do a demonstration. Now, usually I do this demonstration in a room with people where I can see them. This is not the case here. So I will have to ask you to really follow my instructions, okay, in order for this to work. Okay, now, for this demonstration, I'm going to read out a couple of sentences, and I want you not to take any notes, right? Put away your notepads, anything you have in front of you. I only want you to use your memory to try to remember what I'm going to read out to you, okay? So no cheating, okay? Only your memory. And I'm going to start now. The short man bought the broom. The brave man gave the money to the robber. The creative man read the sign. The tall man bought the crackers. The thin man found the scissors. The rich man picked up the chair. The dying man used a feather. The kind man ate dinner. The bald man used the phone. The frightened man ironed the shirt. The dishonest man looked closely at the wrapper. The smart man went to work. Now I would like you to recall this. Okay? Now you can write down anything you can remember. Once you have your number, you can score, get 1 point per correct, and then use the QR code to indicate how many you got right. Put your number in. Don't be shy. It's okay. It's okay. I have a second part to this. Okay. It's all right. Okay, this is where we are right now. Okay. So we have a couple of people who have put in their number there. We are at 1.9, so about 2 words or 2 were correct. Okay. So this is what we have as our initial distribution there. Some more answers are coming in, but I believe that's probably where we are in regard to the level. Okay, right. Now, second part of this, I'm going to read out another set of sentences to you. Again, it will be a list of arbitrary actions, but this time, what I would like you to do is that for each of those actions, please elaborate by imagining a reason for the action. And do this very quickly, okay? So an example, if I read out, the hungry man got into the car, you think about to go to the restaurant. So you think about a reason for the action, right? The brave man ran into the house to save the cat from the fire. So you think about a reason for the action that I'm reading out. Again, do not take any notes, no notes allowed, but just think about an action as I'm reading out the sentences. Here we go. The sad man looked at his new boat. The artistic man put down the knife. The sleepy man bought the mug. The evil man wound up the clock. The blind man hit the flea. The bearded man threw out the coupon. The one-legged man flicked the switch. The religious man used the saw. The long-haired man looked for the pole. The Irish man counted the leaves. The weak man thanked the checkout girl. The patriotic man memorized the words. Okay, here we are again. Write down all words you remember. give you another minute for this. Okay. And now you have the chance. This is a solution. Again, just scan in the code and type in how many you got right. All right, ready for the big reveal? Look at you. You improved. You improved by 2 words on average. And you see the distribution there as well. So we have many more people on the right side of the scale who had, up to 8 or 7 different words correct this time. So what did I do? What happened? And this is not magic, but this is cognitive psychology, right? So the idea is that whenever you can connect something new to something that you already know, your memory for that information will be better. Now, the something new, those were the words or the actions, the sentences I was reading out to you. Those were new to you. But what you have been doing is you connected this now to your own prior knowledge by thinking about a plausible action for this. And whenever we can do that, connect something to your own knowledge, and this is the same for your students as well, for something that they already know, they are going to elaborate, they're going to integrate something into their existing knowledge network. And whenever we are able to do that, they will be better able to remember information in the future. So to wrap up, what we learned is that the conditions that boost performance during practice are not necessarily the same that increase performance in the long term. So quick gains and things that feel very easy usually don't translate into long-lasting gains. When we talk about metacognition, we might ask our students at the end of a lesson, have you understood the topic, right? But after you have just taught it, everything is still clear in their mind, right? So their judgment of their own understanding will be biased. So what I would suggest doing is wait and delay those questions, require them to retrieve information first, so some specific details about what you have taught them, and then ask them how well they have understood the topic. That really helps them to get a better idea of their own understanding. So the final thing I would like to do with you is just some takeaways. So what are your main takeaways from the session? What would you like to try in your teaching? You can again scan the code there and put in your answers. And I'm not going to present this at this stage here, but I'm going to share with you later on the results for that. But it's basically open for you to share your takeaways there. So make sure to do that. And finally, a couple of things here. I lead the tile network, as Robin said in the beginning. So if you're interested in finding more about that, you can visit the website. You don't need to scan the link now. It's just for you. I'm going to give you one QR code at the very end, and I'm going to upload my slides for you on there. I'm also part of the Learning Scientist. We have free resources, blog posts, and so on. We have written a book, A Step Test, A Student's Guide to Learning Better. So you're welcome to explore that. And finally, that is the link that you need in the very end. That is the link to the resources, to my resources, my contact details, and also the slides from today and the activities, the outcome of the activities. I will upload everything under that link, and you can access it at any time. Thank you very much. That's me.
Thank you very much, Karina, for a really fantastic and interesting session. And I also got a much better score on the retest than the when I had to put a reason in than the other one. Thank you so very much for that. I'm going to ask, if you don't mind, now we're right on time, but we did get one question during the session, and if you've got a moment to stay on and answer it, I'd be grateful if you could just respond to this one, which is, I was wondering until how much burden is regarded as a large stack. So this was your kind of stack of cards. For example, 1,000 words in a week would not be realistic.
Yeah, exactly. You're absolutely right. So that was basically a demonstration and that specific study to show that introducing some difficulty in learning and some kind of effort is a good thing. Now, that can vary from one learner to the next, from how much prior knowledge they have, because if they have forgotten it already after, I don't know, 10 cards, then probably I would decrease the number of cards. If they are already really fluent and proficient, then I would increase it and try 50 cards and see how it goes. So it is a bit like with any kind of spacing, it's a bit trying it out. But if you see that, they can go very easily through the stack and know it right away, then they have either mastered it already and they can take it, like put those cards away for those specific material because they have mastered it, or it's just a fluency thing that they at the moment at practice can do, but if you ask them 2 days later, they can't really reproduce. So it is about really using your own expertise, of the material, of your learners, to decide how best to schedule that. So it's not set on 20 cards, absolutely not. So it will depend on how difficult the material is, how much kind of the students already know, and so on. So it's about playing around with this. And the demonstration was really about raising awareness that making it slightly more difficult and having that effort in the process can help them retain information in the future better.